The Legal Resources Center says poor and black pupils continue to be left behind when it comes to digital education. Schools were forced to transform to remote internet-based teaching during the recent COVID-19 lockdowns. But a lack of proper infrastructure and the ongoing electricity crisis have exacerbated the disadvantages of many pupils. Let's discuss how bad the situation is now with Muyenga Mugerwa Sekawabe from the Legal Resources Center. Muyenga, good afternoon. Welcome to today. Thanks for joining us here on eNCA. So how bad is this situation in terms of the poor children being left behind as far as digital education is concerned? What are you seeing?
Hi, good afternoon, and good afternoon to all of your viewers as well. So us at the Legal Resources Center have been doing a lot of research into the issue of digital education, including field research in lots of rural provinces and schools throughout the country. In terms of the latest data we have, only about 20% of schools, of public schools in South Africa, have access to internet and data facilities. And the overwhelming majority of that 20% are former Model C schools, with an overwhelming majority of those schools that don't have access being those that cater predominantly for Black, Indian, and colored learners. It's a very dire situation, which, as you said, was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, what's the impact? I mean, what are the implications of this lack?
Sure. So I guess there are two ways to look at it. There's the situation that occurred during COVID, where there was rotational classes, where children would only go to schools on certain days. And the inequality was really exacerbated then, because as we saw from the former Model C schools and private schools as well, they could continue with the curriculum as normal, whereas a number of the schools we spoke to, especially in the Transkei and Ciskei, or former Transkei and Ciskei, really battled to continue with teaching and learning, with the effect that many school officials were telling us that learners are about a year to a year and a half behind where they would usually be. So our current grade 6 learners only have the skills that a grade 5 learner would have. But as at the Legal Resources Center, we're trying to emphasize the fact that the situation which developed in COVID is not the only reason why we should be looking at digital education. Even without a pandemic, in normal circumstances, it's important that our learners have access to these skills. Computer literacy is something that future employers are looking for in candidates. Universities are looking for potential students who already know how to research. And with our literacy crisis in South Africa, the access to online books and other kinds of educational materials could really assist improving educational outcomes across the country. So whilst the COVID pandemic did make the situation, did put the spotlight on the situation, it's not something that we should be forgetting about now that most of the COVID restrictions have left.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking last week, I hosted the We the Nation episode. We're focusing on basic education, not the whole education system, but basic education. And from the numbers, you can tell that in the public schooling system, particularly, both for urban and rural South Africa, an overwhelming majority of schools don't have, for example, laboratories, don't have a library. They don't even have a computer center or a media center. So there's a huge infrastructure backlog to be dealing with in order to take our children forward, because the world today is already digital.
Yes, that's true. Our politicians like to talk about the fourth industrial revolution and how that's going to change lots of aspects in our lives and employability of learners across our schools. And the lack of infrastructure that you've mentioned as it applies to science laboratories, or even things I guess more basic, such as libraries, it's very much a dire situation. And with respect to digital education in particular, in 2013, the government released norms and standards for school infrastructure, which said that within the next 7-year period, access to internet and to computers must be rolled out in schools. So as I said, that was released in 2013 and was meant to be completed within 7 years' time, which was 2020. Here we are sitting in 2023, and the government has made little to no progress on this issue at all. And as a result, generations of South African learners are being left behind.
Yeah, and that has dire consequences into the future because the skills of the future are in the digital world. Therefore, you are setting up the future generations for huge disadvantage in terms of being active, productive adults in this economy.
Exactly. And like most things in South Africa, this issue has a racial component, whereas we're going to see that children who come from middle-class families or from predominantly white families who went to Model C schools are going to be the ones that have this advantage that people who study in rural areas or in poorer peri-urban areas will not be able to have. So it's a question of equality, it's a question of racism, and these are systematic issues that definitely need to be tackled.
Yeah. So from your research, do you think there's a way that this digital education gap can be addressed? I mean, what are you finding out? You've told us the numbers and you've told us how dire and serious the situation is and how the poor South African pupil child in a township or in a rural village in South Africa is being left behind by digital education. What can be done to address this?
Sure. Yeah, so the statistics are awful. Luckily, during this field, we've seen a lot of innovation in terms of, applications that have been released and created, which seem to try to bridge this gap. As we saw during the COVID pandemic as well, some of our major internet cell phone providers made some of their services and certain websites to be 0 rated. So it's interventions like that to increase the amount of resources that are available online, but also to reduce the costs that students or learners have in accessing this. But at the end of the day, like most of South Africa's socioeconomic issues, it's a matter of budgeting and a matter of prioritizing. Us at the Legal Resources Center, we don't think that it's realistic to expect the government to ensure that every school has internet by the end of this year. But what we would like to see is for the government to have a comprehensive plan and to stick to it so that it can be monitored and tracked. Because in the absence of a comprehensive plan, the current situation is just going to be perpetuated.
Yeah, and I would imagine such a plan would have to include the private sector because government alone cannot resolve this.
Yes. And as we've seen as part of our research, schools that tend to be located more closely to universities tend to have better access to both the human resources. So something that's not really spoken about in digital education is the fact that sometimes teachers themselves do not know how to use certain technologies. They do not know how to teach learners using technology. So what we've seen in our research is that schools that, I guess by the lack of geography, tend to be closer to bigger business centers or close to universities are able sometimes, luckily, to tap into those networks to be able to provide such an education for their kids. But this is a very random and sporadic kind of benefit or approach that exists, which is why we need something more comprehensive to make sure that no school gets left behind. And it's not up to the lack of your geography whether a learner will benefit from digital education and receive it or not.